Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Peculiar Stories, Volume 2, Story Number 1. I'm a nurse who works in the night shift in ER. During my time here, I've seen some pretty horrendous stuff. I've been at this job only a year now, and honestly, I'm surprised I've lasted this long. I suppose the majority of the time it's rather rewarding, saving people, especially kids. But some of the things I'm about to tell you, and despite how unrealistic it is enough to outweigh that fulfilling feeling enough to make anyone quit for good. I'm used to it now. Plus, I've only encountered milder stuff compared to my colleagues. But a certain recent event has made me question where I stand. So, maybe I want your help to understand what the hell is going on here. One of the first things I experienced on the job was more bizarre than scary. She wasn't an old woman, but her hefty and stout stature, with a few wrinkles here and there, inferred of years of unhealthy legal substance abuse. She came in complaining of pins and needles all over her body. She stated, "It doesn't hurt too bad, but I can't move, and static is inside of me." Of course, I immediately thought she was having a stroke. Numbness, tingling, and an inability to communicate properly all pointed to it. A group of more experienced doctors came to run some checks. A few days later, I heard from one of the nurses that the woman died, but not of a stroke. She had died of organ failure, because all of her organs were as old as an extremely elderly individual, as if someone had put the insides of a 90-year-old into a 30-year-old woman. We're talking every single organ, too. The nurse thought that the static sensation the woman was trying to explain was like an increased aging sensation, like growing pains. I laughed, but it still unsettled me. This woman was healthy, no history of drug use, alcohol use, or smoking. Not that they could find despite her outward appearance. It was just purely unexplainable. But that's medicine for you. I found it weird that she didn't seem to have any family. But this is a running trend in these inexplicable experiences. None of the patients ever have any family. After that, things became scarier, weirder. A guy came in bleeding from both eye sockets. No eyes present, but complaints about stomach pains. Obviously, everyone on the night shift is more concerned about stopping the bleeding from his empty sockets. And when I say bleeding, I mean this guy was absolutely going to die from blood loss if we didn't stop it. He really didn't seem to care about his eyes or notice it, and instead was losing his mind about the pain in his stomach. And now we had to get it out of him. I remember the urgency in our voices, telling him how we will sort his stomach out once we stop the bleeding. He starts becoming aggressive, and he was restrained and pulled into an empty room, and the responsibility of keeping this guy alive was no longer in my hands anymore. One of my colleagues, we'll call her A, came out of that room around 45 minutes later, pale as a sheet, and just says one of the most horrific sentences I've ever heard at that point. His eyes, they were in his stomach. When she'd finally settled down, I pressed her about what exactly happened in there. Apparently the guy went totally insane and just ripped into his torso with his bare hands, tearing into his flesh, and ruptured his stomach. He died almost instantly. One of the doctors, I won't say who because he could get into real trouble with this, curiously looked into the stomach and found the guy's eyes swimming around in there. This lunatic ate his own eyes. A didn't quit, but a few other nurses did. Like always, the patient had no family. I think I should mention I don't work in a big city. I work in one of those hospitals that lay in the middle of three small towns, and we're much in the middle of nowhere. We're not exactly the busiest ER department, but we do get a fair share of people who get into accidents on the roads. And so we've received patients from all over the state. Nearly every single one of these horror story patients seem to come from nowhere, and we put their name into a database, and nothing ever shows up. The names they give us lead to nowhere. People from the towns don't know them when their obituaries turn up in the paper, and ambulances never bring them to the hospital. It's like they walked straight out of dense forest to get here. A told me another story of a patient that really creeped her out. I'll be transcribing it from the voice recording I managed to take. I believe it's easier to show the raw experience that way. So, it's like 3 a.m., and this woman walks in with an arrow straight through her neck. Obviously, I'm running checks on her to see how the heck she's walking around with an arrow through her neck. How she's literally acting like nothing is wrong. But she doesn't speak. She's just smiling at me. All these other doctors rush over trying to figure out what to do, but she's just motionless, staring and grinning at me. She was a Miss Blanked Out, the name for privacy reasons. Can't discuss patient information. And she was 37 years old and extremely tall. Basketball player tall, which made me feel even more on edge. Out of nowhere, staring right at me, she just pulls this arrow straight out of her neck. And her neck snaps and she falls to the ground, still grinning. There's no blood, as though the arrow was some built-in support to her neck, and removing it would break it. I just can't get her smile out of my mind. It was as if she was taunting me, like something that wasn't human, as if she knew exactly how to get under my skin. I was on the night shift last night, and I asked some of the other nurses and doctors to find out if anyone else had experienced anything strange, and their responses were, for lack of a better word, disturbing. One of the nurses, let's call him B, said something that really stuck with me because I'd never given it much thought before. Ever seen where the bodies go? I asked him what he had meant by that, because obviously the deceased would be taken to the morgue, or so I thought. B had been a nurse at the hospital since he'd left college, so he had been working at this hospital for a long time, and due to a bad stroke of luck, often during the night shift, I'll be transcribing his story from the recording he consented to be a part of. So here we go. Quote, I've seen a few of those creepy, crawly characters come in here. I don't know what they are. They're not human, that's for sure. He paused and shifted uncomfortably in his seat, peering out of the break room window to ensure no one was listening in. Ever notice how their motions seem false? Like they're pretending to be hurt and show pain? That's true, for the most part. Most accounts of these odd patients have stated the same thing. Lack of real emotion. This one time, a little boy walked in, around 9 or so. He looked completely fine to me, so I'm assuming he's lost, because no adult walks in with this kid. It's just him alone, in the dead of the night. I'm asking him all these questions. If something hurts, where's your mommy and daddy, etc. This kid just stares up at me with these dead eyes. B coughs, clearly trying to regain composure. He opens his mouth and this huge river of water just falls out of his mouth. And it just keeps on coming until the whole floor is covered and keeps going and going. All the while he's just emptily staring at me like a dead fish. When the water stops, he just collapses and dies. This kid had enough water in him to have drowned 2 horses, I swear. Yet he came into the hospital and was walking around completely fine, just looking kind of damp. So, we clean him up, and I'm about to take him in the staff elevator to the morgue. But the senior doctor stops me and tells me that we sent those kind down by themselves. He said that we don't let nurses or doctors be alone with the strange dead patients that come in on the night shift. Those that have no name, or if they do, can't be found to have any trace. I heard that apparently when the morticians open the elevator door, all they find is an empty bed. If what B said was true, that would add up with A's theory that these patients are not human, but that raises more questions than it answers. If the hospital staff know these things aren't human, why do most of the newer staff have no idea as to what they really are? Why has no one informed us? If the senior doctor in B's story was telling the truth, we can only assume something terrible happened to a member of the staff who was left alone with one of the bodies. But why has this been covered up? And finally, if the bodies are disappearing before they get to the morgue, where do they go? B told me of a doctor who knows a lot about these patients, but he retired a few months ago. I managed to get his email address from B, so I'm currently trying my best to arrange an interview of some sorts. Another nurse, C, heard I was compiling these stories and wanted to add her own into the mix, with some added info too. I'll be transcribing the story from her perspective in the same manner I have done thus far. This is what she said. This is my first experience with the patients. C was a senior nurse with graying hair held in a bun. Her thin, slender fingers gripped her scrubs, and I could see she had a nasty habit of biting the skin around her nails. Anxiety. Honestly, at the time I thought it would be my last. I liked this job too much, though, so I managed to get my shit together and carry on, though. This really old guy came in, and I'm telling you, that old man looked near 90 years old. But this fellow was walking like he was 20 years old, completely fine, but in this monotonous tone, he just keeps repeating, "I'm dying, I'm sick," over and over again. I check his vitals, and he's completely fine. And so I start to ask him if he's on any medication for his mind or mental state, and if he'd forgotten to take them, but he keeps repeating that phrase. I'm losing my patience, and I tell him he's physically fine. We just need some cooperation to understand his mental state, and that a team of more experienced doctors will be with us any minute now. You know, child, I've worked with a lot of elderly patients, so I'm thinking he's got a terrible UTI. But no, he finally stopped speaking, and now I'm able to really take a look at him. I realize this guy has no eyelids. Imagine that. Open your eyes really wide, and it doesn't stretch over your eyes. That's all the eyelids you have. This old man suddenly gets up and walks backward out of the ER front doors, never taking his eyes off me. He just walked straight out into the night. It was demonic. She proceeded to tell me that all of these patients seem to only come in between 1 and 3:30 a.m., from what she had heard. I can validate that the other encounters happened during the same time period. But her story reminded me of another one of my encounters, one that I wish I hadn't remembered. This was around Christmas time, one of the busiest times of the year, with how many people desperately trying to make it home to their families. I was on my 5th coffee that evening, trying to get through a ridiculously long work shift after a Christmas Eve party left me rather hungover. An old woman walked in, but unlike C's elderly patient, mine walked like an elderly woman. She said she had taken a fall on her knee, and she found it very difficult to walk on, and that she was in a lot of pain. As a few other nurses went to go fetch her wheelchair, she kept asking me if I would take her to the bathroom. Usually, I would have taken an elderly woman to the bathroom, but when this old lady smiled sweetly at me, I felt like all the hairs on my neck stand up, and I felt really, really scared. I didn't want to be alone with this lady, so I just told her the other nurses will take her once she's in her wheelchair so she won't have to walk. I kept avoiding her gaze, and as I told her that I personally wouldn't be taking her to the bathroom, I felt an urge to finally look at her. For a split second, I could have sworn her old wrinkled face twisted into the most horrific look of anger. You know, those really horrible pictures in SpongeBob when the characters freeze into hyper-realistic, disgusting expressions? Well, it was like that. I just have this plastered image in my mind of her wide, bloodshot eyes and wrinkled old mouth, pulled into an unrealistically wide frown, with its disturbingly powerful look of hatred and anger. Yet, as soon as I had registered it, the sweet little old lady face was back. I was really relieved when the other nursing staff came to look after her, because something just wasn't right about that little old lady. I think back then I blamed it on the coffee, but now I'm not so sure. A was one of the nurses helping that lady, and she happened to be on last night's shift. So I asked her what happened. Apparently the lady was taken to the bathroom by A, and another nurse who waited outside, but after she didn't answer to A and the other nurse asking if she was okay, they opened the bathroom door and found it empty. I guess her sole purpose that night was to get me alone with her, and I'm glad she never got the chance. Also, I wanted to mention how one of the senior doctors cornered me during my break a few weeks ago to tell me not to get involved with what's going on. I don't know how he knows, so it seems I'm going to have to be more wary about my updates. Clearly he knows something, and so my thoughts that there's something seriously twisted and corrupt going on here are feeling more than validated. I'll address some questions that I've had. But anyway, let me tell you a little bit more. I was wondering if any of the nearby hospitals were experiencing the same phenomena. So my coworker, she contacted one of her friends who works at a hospital a few towns over to ask if they had experienced anything odd concerning patients who were admitted between the hours of 1 and 3:30 a.m. They knew exactly what we were talking about, and they knew a few other hospitals in the state experiencing similar things. So we can assume it's at least a zonal thing, if not statewide. C's friend also gave us some stories from their hospital that are really, really weird. I'll be telling you that story in a minute. From their perspective, anyway. So, and here we go. So, my first time encountering these things was last year, around Independence Day, when we had this little girl come in. She must have been around 8 or 9 years old. Anyway, she is the cutest thing you've ever seen. Like, weirdly, ridiculously cute. Like, picture your typical big brown eyes, long eyelashes, rosy cheeks. You catch my drift. Almost too cute. I find it weird that she's on her own at 2 a.m. in the morning, so I ask her if she's lost, if she needs her mommy, etc., etc. She's just smiling up at me sweetly, not saying a word. I turn my back to grab a piece of paper for her to write on in case she didn't speak English or something, and as I do, I hear this sickening crunch sound, followed by this horrible squelching noise. It sounded like a wild animal chewing on a carcass. I turn right around, and this girl has this huge, stretched out smile revealing massive sharp teeth that should not be able to fit into her mouth. Her open mouth stank of decaying meat, and her brown eyes were red? Still brown, but redder? Darker? She then growled deeply and got onto all fours like some kind of rabid dog and ran out of the entrance. It was pretty horrific at the time, but now looking back it's just plain weird. I blamed it on my eyes playing tricks on me until I'd heard what had happened to other nurses and doctors on the ward. I called CPS, but I never got a name, so I could only describe a wild child to them that might be in danger or a runaway. C's friend passed for a long time before she finally said this. You know, there's nothing we can do to stop them. I pressed her on what she meant by this, and she continued. They know how to scare us. They know what really gets under each and every one of us skin. The second time I ever encountered any of these things was around 5 months later. My mom had just died suddenly, and I was really, really hung up about it. I'm a Christian, so I found most of my solace in believing she was happy, in heaven, peacefully watching down at me. C's friend began to cry softly on the phone. C and I told her she didn't need to continue if it made her too uncomfortable to share, but she relented and continued. It's around 1:45 a.m., and this really beautiful woman stumbles in. She was a complete mess. Her legs all twisted, and one of her shoulders was definitely dislocated. I rushed to her aid and started asking her what happened, and proceeded to try and put her broken bones back in place before it cut off her blood supply. The woman looks at me, and she looks just like my mom when she was younger. The same curved up nose, dark hair, almost as if she could have been my mom's cousin or something. She suddenly screams out this is my hell, C's friend's name, and collapses. I just start sobbing because whatever this thing was had told me the one thing that had kept me up in my spirits after my mom's death, which she was saying was completely false, and that my poor mother was reliving her painful death over and over again. She had died in a car accident, all her limbs broken on impact. I don't think my mom really is suffering in hell. She was a good Christian woman who lived a good life. What I do think is that whatever that thing was, it somehow knew exactly how to destroy me. and you exactly how to fill me with dread. Something that you know or knows your deepest fear that makes you vulnerable like that is not something we can get rid of. So, now we know that somehow these things know our fears, what makes us uncomfortable, or how to get under our skin. I'm thinking, and I wonder, and I say to C's friend, is she right that those things do know what disturbs us? If that means they know more about us than we do them? If they've been watching us without us realizing it? I finally got in contact with that retired doctor, the one B had told me about. We met up in a coffee shop to discuss the issues in private. I'll be calling him Dr. D from now on for privacy purposes. I asked Dr. D firstly if he had any experience with the patients. This is what he had to say. When I first started out that job, everything was fine. We'd never had any issues with those things before the early 2000s. Around 2002, I think. I was around 45 back then. So I had seen a lot of pretty gruesome things already. Just a typical awful road accidents you probably know something about. He poured a Jack Daniels miniature into his coffee. There was this one time. This really shocked me. Around 2003 in the spring. Not a massively busy time of the year. And that's the best way I can put it. Shock. A young woman came in at 3 a.m. She seemed fine, possibly a bit moody at worst, but fine. I ask her what's wrong, and she claims her head is spinning. I ask her what she meant by that, and she repeats the phrase again, my head's spinning, doctor. I reach to get her to put a thermometer in her mouth, and her face flashes to one of pure joy. The sickening grin is plastered over her face, and her neck starts twisting 360 degrees around like she's some sort of owl, and she drops dead. I'm alone in this checkup room with her, and I get this overwhelming sense of dread about the body, like I just don't want to touch it, go near it. I know the doctor I should have checked for a pulse, but that woman's twisted neck and grinning face were just so wrong. I stood frozen until that primal sense of fear got too overwhelming, and I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me, and I kid you not, whatever that thing was, I could hear it scratching at the door handle. I got some other doctors, told them what had happened. They didn't believe me and berated me for leaving a patient and not paging someone. But when we opened the door, she wasn't there. It was around 4 at this point, and in looking for this woman, we heard the front doors open and close, meaning whatever it was returning home. After that phenomena grew, doctors and nurses on the night shift were coming out with these crazy stories of inhuman patients. Things so terrified the staff, unfortunate enough to work the hours of 1 a.m. to 3:30 a.m. And then the attack happened. You might be wondering why we don't leave anyone alone with these things, even on the way down to the morgue. It was more of a statement than a question, so I nodded. There was this nurse, E, name change for anonymity. Super sweet girl, cared a lot about the patients. Well, this teenage boy walked in, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. E rushes him into a room to fix his arm, sends the other nurses to get a splint and bandages. They were only left alone for a couple of minutes. He was struggling to finish his story. He had gone a pale yellow color. I asked him what year it was when this incident took place, and he shook his head. He finally spoke again. 2007? Next thing I hear is this guttural scream from the room. So I run towards it. He is laying on the ground, a mangled, bloodied mess. Her bones had been broken and pierced through her skin, and her bottom jaw was ripped clean off and was stuck in her eye. She was left alone for a few minutes. Just minutes. The window to the room was open, some tiny square thing in the top middle of the wall. It had escaped. I ran outside to see where it had gone, if it had gone. I see it, this figure running into the woods. It wasn't a teenage boy, though, anymore. It was some naked, grotesque, humanoid thing. I ran after it, screaming. I was just so angry. It got to the edge of the forest and turned to stare at me. It had these huge, glossy, bloodshot eyes with the black pinhole pupils. It had a wide, lipless mouth stretched over jagged teeth. It was tall, with long arms that reached its knees and pale, oily skin. It was horrifying. And then it smiled. It smiled this huge, horrifying smile, its skin cracking as it was pulled upward at the corner places on each side of its jaw. I saw them. I saw all of them behind it. Shadows, humanoid shadows, standing just behind the tree line, thousands littering the woods surrounding the hospital. And then it walked into the shadows and they disappeared. There are so many of them. And they live in the forests, the woods, the shadows. They pretend to be like us, trap us. They want to kill us, to harm us. It's a game to them, a thrill. That's why I left. You can't stop them. None of us can. That was a few years ago now. I think about it every day. Sometimes I think I can still see them lurking, waiting for me to give in to curiosity and waltz into those woods. I'm scared I might. I was shocked. I didn't know what else to say to Dr. D. So I bid him farewell. This was a lot bigger than I thought it was when I had first started writing about it. I felt hesitant about his answers, though. The things I'd experienced were never on par with anything he had said. And to be honest, seeing an elderly man whose body had long been subjected to years of alcohol abuse talk about such outlandish things led me to be a bit skeptical of his words. Yet there was something unsettling about his eyes. He was traumatized. Dr. D told me not to contact him again, that he'd had enough involvement to begin with. It had been 18 years since the first incident that I can find out about. 13 years since the only death, and we can take the doctor's word as fact. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, so I don't want to get in over my head and assume there's some big cover-up. But with everything I've collected so far, I can't help but think there's something seedy happening. Of course, there's always a possibility that people exaggerate their experiences, hyperbole, for the sake of storytelling. But I trust my co-workers. I don't think there's smoke without fire, as so to speak. To be honest with you, I kind of got wigged out and I stopped talking about this and researching it, and I just couldn't help it. I was, as a matter of fact, ready to leave my job. Something unnerving happened. I'll explain further in a moment. But let's just say it has made me so unsettled that I finally decided to stop playing detective and go find a job as a barista instead. The same job I juggled in college. I was going to leave and have a fresh start and forget I'd ever gotten into this stuff to begin with. Completely erase it from my memory, act like it never happened. But I couldn't. I wasn't allowed to. It was only a few weeks after my last experience when I saw one of them again. A young man around my age. I didn't realize he was one of them at first. He walked in normally, well, as normally as someone with a gushing head wound could have done. To digress, he seemed like a human, a person. He was clutching a motorcycle glove to his head as blood blinded his left eye, and he held his helmet in the crook of his other free arm. I quickly rushed over to him, ushering for one of the other nurses to grab a wheelchair. He spoke fine, albeit with a shaken quality to his voice, and told me how his motorcycle had hit a bump in the road and he'd taken a bad fall and hit his head. I asked him his name, and he said it was Adam. I previously didn't give away patient information, but I don't think I can really class him as a patient. And if I'm being completely honest, I don't really care anymore. He asked for some water, and I obliged, filling up a paper cup as he sat down in the wheelchair, the other nurse walking off to grab some paperwork. I handed him his cup, and as I reached into my pocket to grab my pager, he grabbed my chest. I'm a man, so there wasn't even much to grab, but somehow he sunk his nails into my left pec just enough to pull me forward. I opened my mouth to yell out in pain, but he shoved his glove into my mouth and forced me to look into his eyes. They were no longer blue, but a deep void black. Pupils dilated to an uncanny degree. In a rasping, pluralized voice, he said, "Don't go looking for things you don't want to know the answer to. You are nothing but a pawn in their game." I just stared at him, aghast. His voice had turned into a myriad of many, all fighting to be heard the most, to be the loudest. There was a malicious frown on his face, but the way his brows were furrowed, it appeared more like a stern warning than anything truly wishing to harm me any more than they had done already. Like he tried to mimic a disappointed parent but didn't quite know how to put his features right. Rage and concern and confusion and disdain merging into one uncanny flurry of emotions, and so I continued to stare until the gravity of the situation took hold. I yelled out for help. Luckily, it was an extremely slow day, so he, the other nurse, and I were the only ones in the lobby. He pulled his nails out from my chest and stood up, looming over me. He was suddenly a lot taller than I had registered as he walked in prior, and he walked out towards the sliding front doors. He stopped, turned back to look at me, and the other nurse, who was now fretting over the puncture wounds that were leaking out from my chest and seeping into my scrubs, and suddenly launched his helmet at almost superhuman speed at the lobby's check-in desk, smashing the glass and slamming the computer with it on the floor. The other nurse screamed in fear, and all I could do was watch in horror as he stared me in the eyes, a warning glower, before walking off into the night. That had been enough for me to decide to hand in my resignation letter the next day. I had seen firsthand the sheer power those things had. If he had decided to launch my head into the glass instead of his helmet, I would have been reduced to mush. There was no amount of curiosity that needed to be scratched that could come over my desire to live a decent life. So I decided my super cool, super interesting monster hunting adventure was over. But I wasn't allowed to leave. When I handed my resignation letter in the next day to the head doctor, he led me into his office. He told me that he needed to make some calls to discuss the termination process, and I obliged. Then he locked me in his office. I began to freak out, trying to use my pager to get A or B to respond and get me. No one came. Then a group of people dressed in hospital gear, suits, and smart clothing returned. I couldn't recognize anyone, not even those dressed in scrubs. They all looked at me, stoic and unmoving, until a short, plump woman came forward, smiling perkily. She was far older than me, but not too old, around 50, perhaps late 40s, if my memory serves correct. She had tightly curled blonde hair, and had she not been smiling, I'd imagine that heavy, purpled bags under her eyes would be present, despite the heavy makeup she wore. She took a seat in front of me, ever smiling, and placed both elbows on the desk, her hands interlinked under her chin. "Yes, so-and-so it is. Sorry if it's just disjointed. I don't want to give away my personal data. My name is X. You seem rather unnerved. I assure you there is nothing to worry about." I don't think I replied. I seem to just remember looking at everyone but her, and how they all stared, unmoving, back at me. "I hear that you're asking to resign." She smiled, trying her best to come across as warm-hearted, but the thumping silence in the room made it futile. She sighed before waving her hand behind her, and the others in the room left, albeit hesitantly. I could still see them peering through the glass even after they departed. "I'm afraid you can't." I asked what she meant. Surely no one can be forced to keep a job. I was wrong. She pulled a leather briefcase up onto the table from beside her, clicking it open gently, as if any loud noise would send me trembling like a lamb. She must have been more prepared for my response than I was, and more understanding of my reaction too, as if she'd done this many times before. She gingerly pulled out a brown file and handed it to me, saying absolutely nothing. I opened it and immediately shut it again. It was a forged mental health assessment with a referral letter to a psychiatric institution. I looked on in horror back at her, my mouth agape, in absolute disbelief at what I was seeing. She continued to smile, a forced sympathy plastered on her face. I began to question why, and then vowed to promise how I'd keep my mouth quiet. "Be silent forever," she shook her head. "If you were in our position, you'd do the same. It's imperative that we keep everything that's been happening here under wraps. She dropped her faux sympathies for a more direct approach, looking me sternly in the eyes. We've been made aware of some posts online. I felt my hands sweat, but I'd always been good at lying. Growing up with strict parents helped with that. Don't overreact. That gives it away. Don't try to act too nonchalant. So instead, I just continued to be as bewildered by the situation as before, which wasn't entirely difficult, after being threatened with what was basically a psychiatric imprisonment. She seemed to make the assumption that I was not the one posting online, as that smile glossed her lips once more. The hospital will implement more procedures to make sure you feel safe here. But we cannot allow you to leave work. We cannot discuss anything more with you on the matter. But we truly hope you give us your full cooperation. Are we in agreement on the matter? She asked, a plump finger idly tapping on the file before me. A subtle reminder of what would happen if I withdrew my compliance, so I complied. That's why I haven't updated in such a long time. I didn't want to stay there, to keep having to experience what those things were, especially after I'd seen the sheer power they were capable of. But nonetheless, I couldn't help but write some of my experiences and my coworkers in my diary, which I keep tucked under my mattress in my room. I think I should mention that I wasn't the only one who faced a similar ordeal with the ex and those people. I'd whispered to A over coffee if she'd been visited by family. She seemed to gauge what I had meant and nodded slowly. She'd lost sleep over it too. B was the same and had grown ever more gaunt each day that passed. C had left the hospital. Apparently her mother had grown ill and needed care. I doubt the validity of that very much because I haven't been in contact with her since. Her number was out of service from the moment I'd heard the news. I suppose morbid curiosity must be clawing at you by now, so I'll satisfy you. During the COVID pandemic, things were pretty slow concerning the things. The emergency room during the day and most evenings were filled with those who desperately needed ventilators, so we didn't face anything but the horrors of real-life illness and the fear of catching the disease ourselves. Stress and anxiety were at the forefront of our minds, and exhaustion racked our bodies. But the most harrowing part of the whole pandemic was that whenever they came in, we couldn't even be bothered to react. They'd only come in when the ER was empty, and we were waiting for new COVID patients to attend to. To see them trying their hardest to disturb us was almost comical. After seeing so many of our staff and patients be lost to the virus, we were all so desperately tired of seeing people die from COVID that if one of them came in jerking their body parts around and feigning pain from unnatural accidents, we simply watched them, waiting for them to leave. Sometimes they'd make a big spiel, screaming and smashing things in an inhuman manner. Sometimes they'd just walk out and leave. And as that pandemic persisted, their appearances diminished more and more. Nothing at that time could have disturbed me more than seeing our beloved janitor, let's call him G, succumb to the illness, unable to be surrounded by any family or friends. B had to speak Spanish on FaceTime to explain to his family that we were taking him off life support and to say their prayers and goodbyes. It was the hardest time I've ever experienced as a nurse. But the strangest thing was, I was almost thankful to those monsters for at least allowing us to grieve in peace. Once the lockdown was lifted and things began to gain normalcy again, they came back. I hadn't been there for the first sighting around October of 2021. A nurse I hadn't met before, F, who I joined the hospital as a junior nurse straight out of college to help with the pandemic, was working alongside A. A teenage boy had walked into the ER speaking what A recognized as Korean. He kept pointing outside, crying in desperation, grabbing at their wrist to pull him outside. He was hysterical, and F immediately rushed forward to help follow him outside, but A held F back, trying her best to convey with her eyes that F shouldn't follow him. F wasn't aware of the things, having joined the hospital when their appearance was near to none. The boy was crying, falling to his knees in a truly dramatic display. F is a compassionate person, but she has far less naivete now than she did then. A pulled out her phone, which we were newly allowed to keep on the late-night ER shifts, and used a voice translator to translate what the boy was saying. She could have translated it to herself, but she didn't want to anger the boy. The thing, I won't go into details because it was pretty horrific, but from what I'd heard, but to put it bluntly, the boy repeatedly shouted misogynistic slurs and said that he killed all of her children. When F read it, she sobbed. Once they looked back up, the boy just grinned at them proudly. He did a bow as if thanking them for watching his performance and walked out of the sliding front doors. A had whispered to me on a smoke break that apparently F had grown up with an abusive stepfather for a few years, who would berate her mother when he drank. I suppose reading what the boy had said must have triggered something in her. My next experience came soon after. I was alone at the front desk filling out some admin work on the computer. B was in the bathroom. I didn't hear the door slide open or anything, but a slow tapping at the glass between me and the waiting room alerted me to its presence. I looked forward, until I noticed a small face peering at me from just above the desk. A child. I checked the time, and the fact the waiting room was empty, and realized one of those things. It was a small, bald child. I had no way of determining its gender, but that was the least of my concern. It had a very large cyst on the top of its head. It stared up at me expectantly as if waiting for me to coo over it. I knew what it was. So for the first time in my life, I ignored a patient, opting to sip my coffee and carry on with my work. It clearly didn't like that. As it began to slap small hands against the glass, greasy marks left behind in their wake. I did keep peering at it through my peripheral, but its crumpled, angry face made me snicker. It was like an angry little goblin, and my beyond exhausted state just couldn't take it seriously. That was a bad mistake. It screeched and dropped to the ground, writhing in agony. I couldn't see it over the desk anymore, and I was stuck between checking to look at her or continuing to avert all of my focus to the computer. After a few minutes of silence, a large meaty hand slapped the glass, wiping pus and blood all over the screen. I jumped and decided I had to look. What remained of the small child was a crumpled mess of skin and flesh, one eye popping out from its socket from the pressure of pushing a large muscular arm from its scalp, right where the cyst had once been. The child's tongue lolled out of its mouth, and the remaining eye clouded over as the large hand continued to slap against the glass. It was horrifying, and I began to gag, unfurling the contents of my stomach into the paper bin beside me. The slapping stopped, and I looked up to see nothing. A slow, wet smacking sound bounced around the room, and I shakily looked up over my desk to see the hand pulling itself out of the ER, dragging the crumpled body of the child out behind it, still attached to the bursted flesh atop the child's head. When B came back from the bathroom, and with more coffee, he didn't bother to ask me what had happened. Just picked up the mop and bucket and cleaned up. B never asked me about it afterward. Clearly my green face had told him enough. In late 2022, I returned the favor, but instead he told me about his experience. I had gone out for a smoke break, the smoking area around the building not near the ER entrance for patient reasons, and was leisurely scrolling through Twitter, headphones in. There was another nurse, H, on staff, so I didn't feel bad leaving him alone. When I walked back into the ER waiting room, I saw H consoling B as he sobbed into a red towel. I purchased an audio recording device off of Amazon, as I was too scared to use my phone anymore to record conversations. I've transcribed what he told me. "It's not fair. Why do they do this to us, huh?" he sobbed. "Tamika was my friend. Why do they have to remind me of her?" I asked him what he meant. I told him I didn't think it was good to record him in this state. "No, record me. I'm sick of having to pretend that we aren't being targeted by them." He steadied his breath. H passed him a glass of water, which he gulped down. "She came in, a woman in her 20s. She looked similar to Tamika, but I knew it wasn't her, just someone who reminded me of her. I checked the time and I knew what was going to happen. I knew, and I felt prepared. I wasn't. She didn't complain or say she felt unwell. I did what I do, you know. I smiled and asked her what was wrong, what her name was. They never react too badly to me, especially when I'm nice. She said nothing, just shaking her head at me as if I'd done something wrong. She handed me this. He shakes the towel before crying again. I tell him we can stop once more, but he wants to continue. He's crying, but he's more angry than upset. Tamika had cancer. A nursing student with cancer. What irony. He scoffs bitterly. When she got too ill, she had to drop out and go home. I went to visit her when she was in hospice care. She had this red towel, and she asked me to wipe the sweat from her brow. But I couldn't. I couldn't because I couldn't stand how ill this brave, powerful girl had become. I just cried instead, and she comforted me, when I should have been the one to comfort her, and I haven't been able to forgive myself since. I swore I'd graduate and be able to do for others what I couldn't do for her. But that thing has to give me this and then leave without saying anything. The recording ends there. I decided not to record anymore. B has gone through a very traumatic ordeal, and I'm sure that Tamika forgives him for not being able to wipe her forehead. But there was an added level of horror that those things were capable of. They were capable of knowing what makes us feel guilt, a psychological concept that I hadn't heard of. They were capable of before. I know that they can revisit trauma, as seen with C's friend and F, but never guilt. Those things, those monsters, were trying to break us down as much as possible, more so than I could have imagined. It wasn't just our fears that they knew, but our psyche too, psychological warfare. A became cynical. I actually enjoyed our time on the night shift together because she genuinely began to stop caring. She'd crack jokes left and right, always making the best out of a bad situation. I suppose I should have seen the signs. Last year, she and I were working together. Her behind the desk and the glass, and me on the coffee duty, or as we'd coined it, fodder duty. Being behind the glass meant safety, even if those things came by. Only Adam had ever come close to bothering to break it, and so anyone not behind the glass had a higher chance of being targeted. An old man came in, his walker barely keeping him upright. He looked around and saw me and began to ask for a white man instead. He trudged toward A, asking if she'd kindly ask for a white man to come help him instead. I shrugged my shoulders, and she simply laughed, pointing at the time, 1:02 a.m. Pretty early for one of them, but not unheard of. He began to get irate at our dismissal of him, and so having learnt my lesson from ignoring them, I walked over, telling him that we were the only ones available to take care of him. He frowned and shook his head, saying he'd never let a woman, especially not a Korean, take care of him. A laughed and turned to me grinning. Sounds just like my grandpa. We chuckled over that, rolling our eyes, but I kept watching the old man. I knew I'd completely lower my guard, but A's comment did tickle me. Where we were, in the middle of nowhere, I faced quite a lot of unusual situations. But what happened was that suddenly A stopped laughing rather quickly when she saw the old man shuffle. I walked over to face him, saw him grasping the front of his trousers, extremely inappropriately. His voice was low, rasping, and he spoke harrowing words. I bet your grandpa was always right. He stopped abruptly once, A looking at him in disgust. He took that hand that was against his trouser and tapped the screen. It sounded like Morse code, but I had no way to translate it. A yelled at him to stop it, for him to stop doing what he was doing, and to leave now. The man slowly left shakily on his walker before taking one look back and saying, "Your real grandpa wants you to know that." A stared at me, and then at him, pure fury on her face, and then she crumpled. She didn't want to speak on it, but I knew. She told me before how her grandmother was a comfort woman, and if she could have survived that, A could handle this. But A couldn't, and on Blue Monday this year she leapt off the rooftop of the hospital to her death. I wasn't working that day, but from what H and F told me, she seemed to be at peace before she died. She packed her favorite meal for lunch, sharing it with as many of her co-workers as she could. Then she drank most of a bottle of vodka, took off her shoes, and leapt off the building. We were allowed to go to her funeral, take time off. It was sad to see her smiling face on the portrait of the shrine they'd made. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her face so full of life, like it wasn't a picture. You might be wondering what's made me decide to come back after all this time. I've decided that the fear of going to a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life is culled by the desire to share my story. Well, I'm currently in the elevator to the morgue with one of them. Tonight I was working the night shift. It was just me and Dev. She had asked to pardon herself for a bit and I obliged. My thrill for life wasn't so prevailing anymore. It didn't scare me anymore. I was beyond numb. And then G walked in. In case you've forgotten, G was our janitor, who died of COVID complications during the pandemic. He was a joy to work with, always cracking up jokes and showing us pictures of his grandchildren, who lived out of state. And yet here he was, walking over to me with the same warm smile on his face, a golden canine shining back at me. I teared up. I'm not afraid to admit, and I hugged him. The thing, parading as G. I hugged it. Him. And it hugged back. Patted my back and told me that he knows. I didn't know what he meant, but the thing grabbed his jaw and broke its neck. Even though its body crumpled to the floor, as an actual dead human would have, it winked at me. Still the same warm smile as G had, and pointed a finger to the stretcher. And then the elevator. I know I sound stupid. I know I sound dumb. But I didn't feel threatened, so I put him on the stretcher, covered a sheet over his body. Sorry, it's a body. And now, I'm debating if I should press the elevator button. There's a reason we aren't supposed to go down there, be alone with them. But I feel strangely fine, safe. I've pressed the button. I need to know. And if I can, I'll update you all when I can.